In this video, we will be doing an analysis on every, and I mean every, single team that is in the NFL postseason this year, and just looking at them. We'll be doing it AFC first and going seed by seed. And first, you got the Baltimore Ravens. They were the only team to finish 13-4 this season. We had no, total powerhouses this year. The Baltimore Ravens, they, at the start, they didn't look too consistently good, but they got swept by the Steelers. But the only reason why Pittsburgh won that Week 18 game is because Baltimore rested their starters. Pittsburgh actually is going to be a really dangerous force, and Baltimore is 3-3 in the division. They swept the Bengals, but got swept by the Steelers and split with the Browns. The only out-of-conference game they lost, though, was to the Colts, which I think, is a really important signal of what's to come. Ravens, they don't know who they're playing in the playoffs. It depends. If the Steelers win, they're playing them automatically. That could be troublesome. If the Steelers lose and the Dolphins get evicted, they're playing the Dolphins. If they both lose, it'll be the winner of the Texans-Browns game. Obviously, the Ravens would rather the Texans win because, you just have that going on. As far as the Baltimore Ravens in recent history, they have made many frequent appearances since the 2018 season. Their only miss in the postseason was actually the 2021 season, and that was just a heartbreaking collapse for the Ravens. We've had several of those this year. Unfortunately, the Eagles were one of them. But honestly, this is like the worst kind of collapse you could really have, because in the collapse, they got swept by the Steelers again. And furthermore, they were 8-3, and they were in the 1 seed at that point. They were in the 1 seed at that point at their final win. And they just went down to 8-9, a losing record, last in the division. They also got 12th place in the entire AFC. It was just a really, really embarrassing season for them. They went 1-5 in the division because they also got swept by the Bengals that year. It was just a heartbreaking season for Baltimore that year. But thankfully for Baltimore, they don't have to repeat that. This is the the first time since 2019 that the Ravens are winning the AFC North. And then we have the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills, for the 4th season in a row, they won the East. For the 5th season in a row, and the 6th in the past 7, they made the playoffs. This is after they didn't make the playoffs for 18 years. Now the Bills are starting to get back there in contention. And a 2023 story for the Bills, is nothing short of remarkable. After the game with the Eagles, we obviously saw the Eagles go on that tear. The Bills went in the opposite direction, and they surged. Now, with them being both 11-6, obviously the Eagles still have head-to-head advantage over them. But the Bills are a really powerful team. They secured up the 2 seed to secure the AFC East and a playoff berth. All that with their win over the Dolphins. Actually, the playoff berth they would have gotten anyway had they lost because the Titans beat the Jaguars. We'll get to that. It was a really inconsistent season for them as they, lost to the Jets even after Aaron Rodgers got injured in overtime. They then took a loss to the Jaguars in London. They lost to the Patriots, who were one of the worst teams in football at that time. They then dropped 2 in a row, Bengals and Broncos. The Broncos was in a heartbreaking penalty, 12 men on field, and then they lost to the Eagles in overtime, arguably after Sean McDermott made a very bad decision. And since then, they've won all of their games. All of them. Not, in clean fashion in all those cases, but they, So yeah, that's the Bills. The Bills, they really want to get to the Super Bowl. They want to win the Super Bowl. I don't think they're going to do it. I don't think they're dangerous enough. But the Bills are definitely a team you got to watch out for. Chiefs are not what they once were. They were 11-6 this season after they start off the season, 6-1 and 7-2. But after their bye, they didn't exactly look great. Honestly, they lost the NFL opener to the Lions, and at that point, you knew there was trouble if they lost to the Lions. And from there, they won 6 in a row, lost to the Broncos, lost to the Eagles right before the Eagles collapsed. Then they lost to the Packers and the Bills. They beat the Patriots, but not convincingly. They lost to the Raiders on Christmas. They did win out from there, and that win over the Bengals was huge. They secured the West for the 8th consecutive year. This is going to be their 9th consecutive playoff berth. They're going to attempt to go for their 6th consecutive AFC Championship game. As you can see in this, it was 2022 was their 5th, so they want to go for their 6th. But if they make it there, they're very unlikely to have home field advantage. Patrick Mahomes, has never played on the road in the playoffs ever. He might have no choice but to do that. I'm not done. The Houston Texans, they somehow won the South. The Houston Texans is their first playoff berth in 4 years, first time winning a title in 4 years. The Houston Texans have actually never been a wild card team. They've always did it by winning the South, which, despite the sucking, they were actually one of the more dominant teams of the 2010s decade. And they never made it past the division round. They want to get to this AFC Championship this year. And they start off 0-2. That's normally a concerning sign. Lost to the Falcons, dropped them to 2-3. They were 3-4 after their loss to the Panthers, and it was one of the Panthers' only 2 wins. And the more embarrassing part was that the other team to lose to the Panthers, the Falcons, the Texans also lost to. Didn't matter, though. They got huge last-minute drives against the Buccaneers and Bengals. The Texans managed to score a touchdown in, less than a minute against the Buccaneers. But then they struggled against the Cardinals, lost to the Jaguars, beat the Broncos, lost massively against the Jets. The Titans, they won on a last-second field goal, lost to the Browns, and they beat the Titans. They demolished them, and then they beat the Colts. An iffy season for Houston, but one that was ultimately successful. The Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns are a team that start off 2-2 and had one of the first buys, and ever since then they were just lights out. They beat the 49ers, of all teams, and that's what you have to understand. The Browns beat the 49ers, and now they're 2 of the most powerful teams in football. Yes, taking the Colts down to the wire is concerning, but I mean, they swept the South. They beat the Titans 27-3. They beat the Colts 39-38. They beat the Jaguars 31-27. The Texans, they beat 36-22. They swept the AFC South. And once we knew the South would be getting the 4th seed, the Browns really should have nothing to worry about. Now, obviously, there's still going to be a game. They have lost, to the Steelers and the Ravens and Bengals. They split all 3 teams. And losing to the Broncos by that margin is concerning, especially considering that it's the Denver Broncos. They lost to the Rams. They lost to the Seahawks. They lost some seasons they shouldn't have lost to. But they were 11-6, and they could have easily been 12-5 had they played their starters, but they didn't, obviously. The Dolphins, they failed to secure the AFC East. They hadn't secured that since 2008. They still want to win their first playoff game since 2000, and that's going to be very difficult. This is after they pretty much led the charge for most of the time. I think that really, the only time where it was, in doubt that the Dolphins would win was when they lost to the Bills in week 1, and they were both tied 3-1. They got swept by the Bills. They did sweep the Jets and the Patriots, but they got swept by the Bills. They lost to the Chiefs in Germany. They also lost to the Eagles. That game is always going to be an asterisk next to it because of ref interference. They somehow lost to the Titans despite having a 27-13 lead with 3 minutes left. And then they also got their ass kicked by the Ravens. Dolphins, they could have been in the 1 seed had they won that game. And now they've fallen to 6. Pittsburgh Steelers, their team has been really iffy because they were at 7-4. They were sitting strong at 7-4. Then they fell to 7-7, and Cardinals and Patriots. Those are 2 of the worst teams in all football right now. And they lost to the Colts. Their playoff odds went down to 9%. But then they won their last 3 games, and with the Jaguars' loss, Pittsburgh is in the playoffs. Pittsburgh is in the playoffs. And they also won 5 out of their 6 games in the North. Their only loss was to the Cleveland Browns. So if you have an AFC North debacle, expect the Pittsburgh Steelers to get on top. Like, just expect that. Finally, because the Jaguars just had such a horrible collapse, I didn't want to include them. Just because of how horrible the collapse was. The Jaguars had a collapse that was worse than the Eagles' collapse. I just want to put that out there. I mean, I get that they were playing harder teams and whatnot, but everyone says the Eagles had the worst collapse in football. The Eagles had like probably the second worst collapse in all football, but the Jaguars, theirs was worse. They were sitting strong at 8-3. They had fallen to 1-2 after a loss to the Chiefs and Texans, and then rose to 6-2 after a 5-game win streak. But after their bye, they got demolished by the 49ers. They did sneak out wins against the Titans and Texans, and they also swept the Colts. But then they lost 4 straight, Bengals and OT. Then they lost to the Browns. Then they lost to the Ravens. Then they lost to the Buccaneers. They beat the Carolina Panthers in a shutout, so I thought they'd be able to pull it off against the Titans. They couldn't. And with the Steelers win, they just choked away the division. The Dolphins also choked away the division, but it was different. You had a very resurgent Bills team. The Houston Texans during this time were not actually all that good. But the Jaguars, ooh. Now for the 49ers, they've had just this really iffy season where they start off 5-0 along with the Eagles, lost 3 straight to the Browns, Vikings, and Bengals, and 2 of those teams aren't even going to the playoffs. Vikings finished 7-10. I actually do want to kind of walk you through that, and the Broncos, because I'll go through some teams that didn't make the playoffs, but I want to go through really quickly. But then they come out of the bye with a blowout win over the Jaguars. Then they beat the Buccaneers, sweep the Seahawks, beat the Eagles, beat the Cardinals. They lost to the Ravens on Christmas. Then they beat the Commanders and lost to the Rams. But honestly, the 49ers almost wanted to beat the Rams because this guarantees that if the Packers move on from the wild card round, they will play the 49ers. And obviously, the 49ers and Packers, you just look at the 49ers Packers rivalry, it is not nice to them, especially in the playoffs. The 49ers, they might only be on a 1-game win streak over the Packers. Packers, they've been doing good in the regular season, but you just look at the playoffs. 2012, it was a 49ers win. 2013 was a 49ers win. 2019 was a 49ers win. 2021 was a 49ers win. And, that was with Aaron Rodgers, of course. And the Packers did win the 2001 playoff game, and they were 4-1 against the 49ers until then. Now they've dropped to 5-4 in the postseason. We have to see what Jordan Love can do if this happens, but yeah, 49ers should be pretty confident. And honestly, they're a team that's better than their record. I hate to say it, but they're better than their record. Cowboys, they're also 12-5, and they unfortunately won the NFC East. Honestly, though, Cowboys, they did. I hate to say it, they kind of deserved it. When you just look at it, they shut out the Giants week 1 at MetLife, and then they beat the Jets 30-10. Yes, they lost to the Cardinals. Yes, they got blown up by the 49ers. And yes, the Eagles beat the Cowboys in Philadelphia. And yes, they had the losses to the Bills and the Dolphins, but they were pretty consistent. And they had that 5-game win streak involved. They beat some pretty good teams during that stretch, and honestly, for the for the Cowboys, they just yes, that Week 17 game will live in infamy, but it's hard to say that if it didn't happen with the Giants or with the Eagles have been able to beat the Giants with how much they've been struggling recently. I think they would have tried a little bit harder, so I think that it's a possibility that we could have gotten it. Maybe just with the right momentum of a Cowboys loss, would have gotten it, but it's tough. It certainly is tough. Now you have the Lions. The Detroit Lions are 12-5 as well, but they lost to the Cowboys, so they're stuck at the 3 seed. They had a heartbreaking loss to the Bears. This game was a historical game because the Bears had 98.8% chance of winning it, the game, and the Lions were down 2 scores with only 3 minutes left, and yet they still pulled off a miracle to win. They also had the ball for less than 20 minutes, and yet they had 3 turnovers, and for the first time in history, a team who did that actually was able to win the game. They did lose to the Seahawks in a shootout in overtime, so good thing that the Lions won't have to worry about the Seahawks in the postseason. They lost to the Ravens. They got squished by the Ravens. Lost to the Packers on Thanksgiving, and then you had the loss to the Bears and to the Vikings. But the Cowboys. But they did sweep the Vikings at the end there. They had a very good win over the Denver Broncos. And they've honestly been a pretty consistently good team all season. Honestly, the Lions, I have them going to the Super Bowl. I know it's a controversial take, but I think we're going to see Browns, Lions in a Super Bowl. And, just look at momentum. The Lions have the momentum going for it. They really want it. And they're going to fight to at least be in a Super Bowl. And so will the Cleveland Browns. Buccaneers, they won the South, and, why, and, looking at their record, why should you comment about the Buccaneers? They were 2-0 until we beat them in our best one of the season. But then they had their losing streak in October and November, where they went from 3-1 to 4-5 to 3-5 to 4-5 to 4-7. So they went from 3-1 to 4-7. Then they did the opposite of us. They won 5 of their last 6 to go to 9-8 and win the division. So why should I be confident? Well, first of all, this was the best win of the season, and it was when the Buccaneers were still good. Yes, they barely beat the Vikings, and the Bears win was also unconvincing considering how much the Bears sucked to start the season. But you look at this, and it's like, you have to balance the Buccaneers. It's like, yes, they have 5 wins, but also you have to analyze them. Like the Panthers, in both cases, competitive games. Yes, they swept the Panthers, but the Carolina Panthers, their first game was a field goal margin of victory, and their next game they shut them out, but they were held to single digits in terms of points. They were held to single digits in terms of points against a team that, let's look at it, is 2-15. You look at their wins. They beat the Texans in Week 8. They beat the Falcons in Week 15. That's it. They had 2 6-game losing streaks in their season. 2 losing streaks of 6 games. And they went over the Jaguars. Well, the Jaguars are also a bit of a collapsing team. Falcons, they really had the collapse of a lifetime considering how, they were 6-6 and they fell to 7-10 with 4 losses, including one to the Panthers and a blowout against the Saints and against the Bears. And the Falcons-Buccaneers game was still competitive when the Falcons were on a collapse. Really, I guess Jaguars and Packers were the only convincing wins during this period. Obviously, it's better than what the Eagles had, but you just look at it, and with the Eagles being able to beat the Buccaneers in Tampa, I do see this game between the Eagles and Buccaneers. It's going to be a good one. But yeah, looking at the Eagles, what happened really was tragic. I mean, 10-1 and 10-1 and finishing with 6 losses. The Jets in '86 did that, and they won a playoff game. And then when they lost in the divisional round, they did so in double overtime. But the playoffs were a bit different back then, and it was a bit easier for them. You also look at their point differential. What is it up to? +5. Look at their wins. Most of them were not very convincing. Yes, you put together 2 5-game win streaks. But look at it. The Patriots we beat by 5. The Vikings we beat by 6. That's both one-score games. The Buccaneers, we beat by 14. The Commanders, we took to overtime. Look at how much and yes, we did sweep the Commanders, but look at how much they suck. For 113, Commanders on an 8-game losing streak, and they got swept by the whole division. The Eagles swept them, the Giants swept them, the Cowboys swept them. The Cowboys also, yes, swept the Giants, and the Eagles could not do that. We have our loss. We have our Buccaneers game that's won by 14. Rams is won by 9. Dolphins is a 14-point win. Those were our only 2-score games that we won all season. We lost to the Jets of all teams to put us down to 5-1. Yes, we seemingly put things back together, but Bills and OT was, a big one. 49ers, and at first I was like, okay, just one game. Cowboys, I was like, okay, just 2 games. Seahawks, it was close. And I was like, okay, we're really bad now, but we're in the easy part of our schedule. It's just a 3-game skid. I was like, the 49ers also a 3-game skid. And when we beat the Giants, I was like, okay, I know that it wasn't a convincing win, and it was by 1 score, but we beat the Giants. I was like, we're at 11-4. We kicked the Giants out of the playoffs. And I was like, all we have to do is just win out. And that went horribly. I don't know what we were doing. It's like we were already not a great team, and we decided to just become a bad, horrible football team. All of a sudden, we just decided to become like the worst team in all football. I don't know why. It's annoying. The Rams, who fell to 3-6 before their bye. They beat the Seahawks to open up. They actually swept the Seahawks. They also swept the Cardinals, and they swept the 49ers. Like the 49ers, the Rams are also 5-1 in the division. Cardinals 0-6, Seahawks are 2-4. I don't know what to tell you. And yes, their Week 11 game was down to a missed field goal, but that was an important game to keep their season alive. They beat the Colts in OT after having a 23-point lead over them. Obviously, they beat the Cardinals, but the start of the season was like not convincing for them. Yes, they lost to the 49ers and they lost to the Bengals, and the Bengals were somewhat good. They lost to the Eagles, Steelers, Cowboys, Packers, and then as it got easier, they began to have convincing wins. Their only loss after the bye was to the Baltimore Ravens, and they still dragged them to OT. They finished off the season on a 4-game winning streak, having won 7 out of their last 8 to finish 10-7. And Packers, they saw off 2-5, then they go to 3-6. They actually beat the Rams 20-3. They beat the Bears to start off by 18 points. Then they blow it against the Falcons, but then do the opposite against the Saints. They were very early buying there as well, but then they lost to the Raiders and the Broncos and the Vikings. It began to look really bad for them. But then they pulled out of it. 3-6, they won 3 straight. Chargers, Lions, Chiefs. But then they lost to the Giants and the Buccaneers. But then they beat the Panthers, the Vikings, and the Bears to somehow get a postseason spot. And, there's some other things I want to look at, like the 2023 Minnesota Vikings. I think are an interesting case of how, a team, can just get so close and yet be so far. Because, like, the Vikings, they started 0-3. They lost to the Buccaneers, Eagles, and Chargers. Although 2 of those games were against playoff teams. They beat the Panthers by 1 score, and then they lost to the Chiefs. But to get a 5-game win streak, including a win over the 49ers, they'll also beat the Bears, the Packers, the Falcons, and the Saints. Here's the thing, though. The Vikings, they got swept by the Lions. And that's really what dudded them in for doom and destruction. Well, not really. But, they were 6-4 against the Saints. Then they lost 2 straight to the Broncos and the Bears. They were 6-6 for their bye. They beat the Raiders to make it 7-6. But look at how ugly the game was. It was like first to a field goal. Then they lost the Bengals in OT, and then they got swept by the Lions and lost to the Packers. Like at week 14, they controlled their destiny to win the NFC North. They lost that from there. 23 Denver Broncos, another interesting case. A team that started off 0-3. Then they fell to 1-5. Then they put together a 16 win streak. By the way, their win over the Bears was a huge clawback kind of victory after losing to the Raiders, Commanders, and Dolphins. I mean, like, they lost to the Commanders. Come on. And then Jets and Chiefs they lost to. But then they beat the Chiefs after they beat the Packers. Then they go on a bye, and they beat the Bills, Vikings, and Browns. So in November, they're still pretty happy. But then they lose to the Texans. Beat the Chargers, lose to the Lions and Patriots, beat the Chargers again, so they swept the Chargers. But then they got swept by the Raiders. They were at 7-8, so they weren't going to make the playoffs anyway, even with their win. But they couldn't finish it above 500.